Yeah, so we're going to talk about how do you resolve disagreements. They could be a trivial disagreement, like whether the thing should be numbered or not. They could be an important agreement, like disagreement. One of the things was, is education part of decentral? Like, should that be part of the blueprint? Judith is not getting sound. Is anybody else not getting sound? I don't think so. All right, so that's probably on your end, Judith. Maybe your Bluetooth headphones ran out. Maybe I could say whatever I want and you wouldn't know what I said, so I'm not going to give you any advice verbally. How about I not give you advice verbally? So we're talking about disputes. And so what I'd like to start with is people to check in and talk about either a really bad or a really good experience in a disagreement in any organization. I prefer that it's not going to be, well, the boss decided, right? I prefer that it's a good experience in which people had to, they didn't necessarily have authority over one another, or a bad experience when people didn't have authority over one another. And so I'm just going to let you kind of chime in, and if the person before you picked a really bad experience, try to think of a really good one, but you don't have to, like, you know, pick whatever speaks to you. So if you hear somebody talking about a good experience and you've got a bad one you want to share, like, maybe you should raise your hand next. Does that make sense? Nobody is indicating me in any way that this makes sense, but let's see. Okay, at least one person's, okay, I got some thumbs up. Okay, so who would like to share either good or bad experience of resolving some disagreement in an organization?
I've got a fairly good experience, which may not always be applicable in every situation, but a group I was part of, we had a kind of, I mean, not a policy, more like a process of, if there was a significant disagreement, finding out why people think as they do, because then often that will shift a little bit what you think. If you're like, yes, it should be numbered, and then somebody says it shouldn't be numbered because, you kind of go, oh yeah, I've not thought of that. And then you have to give it a bit of time for things to settle. And that's where I say it might not be applicable, because if you've got to make a decision quickly, then you can't do that. But basically, yeah, it's good to give it time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll also tell about an experience in the meanwhile. This was a centralized organization, so there was a CEO, and he couldn't come to an agreement between, it was in the crypto space, and they had to decide what jurisdiction to incorporate in and how to just launder their money. They had raised money in a 2017 ICO and they hadn't done AML. And so they had to launder the money because there was no way of going backwards. And they had to figure out, like, how do we, you know, and what jurisdiction. And the lawyer and the CFO disagreed about it. And they had been talking for weeks and weeks. And so what we did was we created a decision table of all the factors, so not just why, but each factor, and then we weighted the factors. Okay, because of the taxes, because of the, you know, distance, because of the cost, because of this, and then by creating a decision table, instead of having general arguments, they were able to focus in. And then when they did the weighted decision table, it turned out they didn't actually disagree. They disagreed about why, but they didn't really actually disagree when they did the weighted decision table. They found there were only some things that they needed to resolve. And so that was a really good process, which is a little bit similar to what Vanessa is saying, is they made visible the different counterpoints and points of their arguments. They made visible their thinking. Well, for the lawyer, the most important thing was this, but for the financial person, the most important thing was how much taxes are we going to pay? And so by making visible which things they thought were the most important factors, they were able to reach an agreement. So, yeah, maybe I'll tell about a bad experience if nobody has any, but I bet somebody here does. So what experiences do people have?
I can go. I think but it's not from any particular organization. It's basically from living on this planet. That it's not kind of like a broad context, but it feels to me that the bad way we deal with disagreements is by becoming by kind of like a mechanism of collective schizophrenia, that some things just become relegated from a particular social structure or context, from like being noticeable, you know, because they don't agree with what is speakable here. So, to some extent, all organizations have that, yes, that there is a particular way of like what can be noticed, what can be brought up, what can be put on the table, and what things are basically you know, like nobody,
Yeah.
nobody can notice them. Yes, so they are kind of like out. Yes, they are out, and this is a way of solving disagreements. Yes, because there's like apparently a lot
Can
of
you
arguments.
give an example? Because like what
So,
things
okay,
like
so
you're not allowed to
let's take,
speak about, for
yeah,
example,
let's
right?
take an example. I become a very, let's say I become a very charismatic leader of organization professing decentralization. You see the paradox in it? You know, I become a very charismatic leader professing decentralization, and you know, like this kind of like Monty Python, you know, like Life of Brian. Tell us more. You know, like decentralization. Yes, you know, so this kind of a thing, and nobody like can like point to that because it's like not within the discourse of the group. Yeah. So like pointing to that is kind of like like how do you say this doing with the balloon, yeah, like you do like, and you cannot do that. So it is a consensus building mechanism, which is like a collective stupidification mechanism, I would say. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that also when you're in an organization and somebody actually decides who gets salaries, right? And actually sits on the wallet, right? So you might have decentralization, but whoever sits on the wallet, and then it's like nobody wants to say anything against that person because, ooh, you know, that's who pays me. So taboo topics that you don't even know if there's a disagreement. Anybody else have examples of disagreements that were settled in their organizations, either well or badly, experiences that they'd like to share as our check-in? I know that you think you're not going to have to speak, but you know, if we finish our check-in, we're just going to go to breakout rooms. So yeah, I just would love to hear some examples.
Okay, I can add to that. Hi, Grace. Hi, everyone. So let's make a wider organization, so a country. Just legislation, for example, renewable energy legislation, distributed energy legislation. I worked with some congressmen. 2017. In a federal system, so one province or one state two different states applied different strategies to regulate this legislation that brings solutions, goods and bads for the application of technology. To regulate it and to introduce this, the benefits purpose behind the law. And they both have conflict of interest, because you have different energy cooperative, different businesses you're gonna impact with this, okay? So one still haven't regulated, so it's 2017 and today, so it's almost 5 years. So this powerful legislation didn't have the chance to impact on the community. And another state like Córdoba has. And so the difference between one and the other not only is decision making, so they didn't impose, but they really build rules, and they didn't let, and this has with the discussion we're having, Grace, on conflict resolution on the document, is like they didn't let the personal interests of these individuals or small organizations to impact on the benefit of the common good, that is renewable energy. So they trace a roadmap that will limit them to impact on this. And today is the state with more renewable energy generated by users in this country. What I'm trying to say is they plant a rule. It's like playing dice or blackjack. It's like, if you go over 21, you're done. So you have limits. You have rules of engagement, something we discussed with John several times. So they plant a roadmap, and not only that, they build how do you call limits? They trace goals, and after achieving them or not, they will analyze results, and they will be, that way you are able to, again, pivot on a business model or something. Is like You need results to study. And once you have that, you see what's good or not, you can check, delete, or change. But so long story short, there's a state with a lot of renewable energy, and there's another one that doesn't, because they haven't found a way to resolve their conflict of interest. So I don't know if that's useful. And it's an example.
I think it's incredibly relevant and incredibly useful, right? I mean, and as we had this discussion in the document, it was like, well, I'm now on the Supervisory Council, and the Supervisory Council was designed so that after 6 months, you can't, like, it ends, right? And I either delivered the blueprint or didn't. But, you know, I could write in the blueprint that we should extend the Supervisory Council and increase their salaries, right? That would be my interest. And it's the same if you get money from deep funding, right? You're kind of competing with somebody else, and it's a zero-sum game. So when it comes to money, it's there's always a conflict of interest. And even if you're very self-aware and you say things like I do, there's a part of your brain that doesn't exactly belong to you. Like, most of us are aware that there's a part of our brain that is doing things. It's like, I'm not going to have that dessert. And then the dessert is served, right? And it's the same with the money, like, oh no, I'm above that, I'm not going to try and extend my thing, blah, blah, blah. And it always comes in. And so, and I think the thing that you said about KPIs is incredibly important. In the blueprint, one of the things that we've decided is to have a section that says, how will we know that it's more decentralized? And one of the, so the KPIs is something like, people who are not part of the foundation will be part of the decision, for example, or the number of people making the decision will be larger. And then we put in one, it's kind of a joke, but it's like, it's not exactly a joke. It's like, Jan will disagree with at least one of the decisions, and it still gets passed. And it's like, okay, that's a sign of decentralization. And so those are measurements that we can say whether they happened or not. Maybe he'll lie, but those kinds of measures we'll know if we do an experiment of decentralization, did more people participate or did they not? There'll be an objective way to know, did we actually reach decentralization of this particular function of the organization? And so I think it's incredibly important. And if you see, the opposite, like Guillermo's talking about in government, but for example, the example he gave is perfect, right? Everybody is supposed to have signed on COP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to whatever we are, 28. And nothing gets implemented. So it's really nice that we signed on these agreements, but nobody kept them. So awesome. Anybody else have conflict resolution or different kinds of ways to handle things that they have agreement, example of how it went off or didn't go or went great? I mean, all of you have been in situations that didn't go great, for sure. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it would be an ambassador program context where sometimes there's it's a bit of a balance between people being involved with each other's work, and sometimes people feeling others are a bit too involved with their work, basically. Like there's transparency and auditability, but also, yeah, sometimes if people dive deep, it gets perceived as micromanaging, as just bothering somebody just because you can. Well, there's not a clear one-size-fits-all solution to that, but what seems to work so far is to, first of all, take a little bit of time out of it, like create a bit of a neutral emotion rather than try and solve things in the heat of the moment. And after a while, it turns out usually people are coming from a shared good place with the best interests in mind. Trying to not call out specific cases because it's a bit awkward, but yeah.
Yeah, I heard somebody recently talking about de-escalation training, and in Extinction Rebellion, they have de-escalation training. And can you imagine an entire country where everybody had de-escalation, like you put it in your high schools and everybody had de-escalation training? You'd have a really, really different country if people knew how to say, like, oh, you know what, I'm really triggered, I need to leave the room right now because I'm freaking out, Even just de-escalating yourself, most of us don't even know when we get into that emotional state, and we don't know why. I've been a professional writer for a long time, and I noticed a few years ago that whenever I get comments, which is every time I write anything, right? Like I write a blog post or a business plan or I see a white paper, as soon as they send me comments, when I first read them, I think, these guys are idiots. I can't believe they're, and like my brain is going off all the time. It just goes off. And so as soon as I noticed that I think that every time, I just knew, okay, I always have to give it a first read. During the first read, my brain will say what idiots all these people are. And then, you know, I'll take an hour off and then I'll come back. But I just know that my brain will say that. No matter what anybody wrote, no matter how smart it is, I will immediately think it's not smart. And, you know, again, that's training my own self and understanding my own personality. You know, so it's personal de-escalation strategy. It's like, go have a drink of water. Cool. Maybe we could take one more.
Good to know. You know, in writing to you. Okay, give it. It's an interesting observation to have about yourself and this.
I hired somebody and I told them that that was true, and then we were sitting in a meeting and I got a text, and I was you know, and I was like, oh. She's like, oh, that I see. You know, she said, why do you think that? And I'm like, there's no reason, right? And I mean, if you look at your own brain, you'll see that there's something you always think is very consistent. So let's hear from Antonia. Great.
So this is an example from actually my grad school. So I had a small, kind of a small study group of fellow classmates, and we'd done a bunch of personality profiles prior to joining in our group. And these were, and my group was absolutely sort of the mavericks, the very kind of the high energy leaders, but also tend to be kind of do their own thing. I tend to be much more collaborative and somewhat more passive. So I chose this group intentionally because they all triggered me personally. So one of the things that we found as a group is that because we were all real high performers, and if anything, much like probably many of the people on this call, if you've ever done group work before, you know, there's always one person who really frequently works, like is the workhorse of the group, at least one. This was our entire group. So when you have an entire group of workhorses, it gets very tense. So one of the things that we had to do to resolve conflict so that we could move forward is we had to assign one person whose only job was maintaining the well-being of the group. So their primary job was to watch the tension resolve and step in if the conflict got too much. Their job was to make sure we were all hydrated, and their job was to look up YouTube videos to make us laugh in between when things got too heated, or have us go for a walk. This is to say that they didn't participate in doing the project, but it was their primary function to maintain the well-being of the team. And that's how, and we were very successful with having that person, and that role rotated.
That's fabulous. That's a great thing, like having roles, knowing even like personality profiles, knowing each other personality profiles, having some insight into who's in the room. And that's even cultural, right? We do it automatically. We're like, okay, Grace, American accent, whatever, it sounds like, you know, and we're automatically putting labels on each other all the time. But having something like that, like we have a standard personality profile for everybody. And I know that here in SNET, we've been working on reputation. So let's see, we got two more, and then maybe we'll go to, or one more, we got TiVo, and then maybe we'll go to breakout rooms. So go ahead.
Yeah, adding on top of what Peter said, because I don't need to go far to find conflicts. And one was mentioned where, yeah, like one way to solve is not do anything, just let that conflict sit in and see what time does it. But when there are policy decisions that matter to somebody really a lot, then what usually has happened is that this is reintroduced in even better format. So going into like written statements or writing it out why and listing pros and cons, where usually the first time when it pops up, it's more like, hey, I have this idea, let's implement it. And then no, we cannot do this. And then maybe the discussion gets heated before diving into deep. So we are having that time between solves the problem, and if it doesn't, it gets even more kind of asset behind it to prove that this might be a direction. And another thing which there is a lot what happens in ambassador program is that especially if it's about prioritizing an activity or a task or a resource allocation, it's like, hey, which one we should do first, or like something like that, then it most oftentimes resolves, and if there's a conflict, it resolves that both of these are done, because the energy from the conflict side that is coming, they actually is going to lead their how to, or their way of method of doing it and implementing. And then another person who is against that, they lead their own way. And this way it's like people can, it creates an overhead because you maybe sometimes do the same task, but two different ways. But another way to think of it, the ambassador program is like more experimental ground, and we can do these kinds of things where we just do same things, two different ways, and then we have comparison and can actually have even better and greater discussion afterwards, after we see results. And sometimes there is no right way, and both of them are correct. So it's based on personality, and that's also learning we can take.
It's actually, when I did my MBA, I think there's a famous case, it might have been Sony or something like that, that regularly appoints 2 or 3 competitive teams to do a thing and just sends them off to do their thing separate from one another, and then they come back and present to each other. And so competition is a way, if you're budgeted like Sony, it's a great way to do that, right? It does require some budget. There's a trade-off in terms of monetary efficiency, but I think that, yeah, I mean, efficiency is kind of one of those things, right? Like, what's efficiency? So cool. So I'm going to present some of the things that have come up either among ourselves as a supervisory council or in the comment sections or other places that we think are discussions. And hopefully Judith has the breakout rooms ready. And you'll choose the breakout room for something that you feel strongly about one way or the other, and start to have a discussion of it and see what you come up with. It's both for us to get a sense of how the community feels about these things, but in some ways it's also a sense of how do we, like, when we come back to the main room, I'm going to ask you, how did it go, and what were the ways that you managed to reach a consensus? And you know, it'll be interesting. Sometimes, you know, somebody say, well, we just, you know, we discussed it and we talked it out, and the other person will say something like, I decided to give up. So if you're the person that decided to give up or whatever, do speak up about it. And if you don't want to speak out directly in the room, you can text me directly and say, like, I just gave up because they were jerks. And then nobody has to know who said that about whom or whatever. But make sure you say that, because sometimes we don't know how it was decided, because one person will say, it was decided, oh, I thought that person had the most expertise. And the other guy, like, I thought you had more expertise than me. So it might even be, people sometimes do that. They defer to other people who the other person's like, but I thought I should defer, you know. So whatever your thought process is, we're going to try and make that a little visible. So like I said, part of the purpose is to actually discuss these topics and see where we stand on them. But part of the purpose is for you guys to see how decisions are made and maybe understand your own thought process and other thought processes in what's happening. So let me announce the projects, the topics. I had already mentioned on whether to number the document or not. Some people feel strongly about that. Some people just don't care. Don't go if you don't care, but some people do care. I've been a writer for a long time. Boy, I've had a lot of discussions about whether to number the document or not. Another topic is existing programs. So there's something that I called grants programs, and Peter crossed it out and he wrote deep funding. And I'm like, deep funding is the name of an entity that we already have. And so is ambassador program. Esther put in ambassador program. I'm like, that's not a function. That's an entity serving a function. And so I don't think that the words deep funding or the words ambassador program should be in there. I should think it should be, you know, marketing or community relationships. And then maybe ambassador program is a subset of that. But other people are like, no, we have to preserve the deep funding program, or we have to preserve the ambassador program. It needs to be one of the headings in the blueprint. So if you feel strongly one way or the other, that is the room for you to debate that topic. Should we include the existing programs as part of the blueprint? Another topic is education and documentation. I squished them together just because it's not an enormous brute. Should education and documentation be part of the blueprint? Are those discussions that we need to talk about how to decentralize the documentation, how to decentralize the education? Is that part of the blueprint? I don't know. It definitely came up last week. People felt that those were important things that were missing from the blueprint. Diversity and inclusion, that came up in our first discussion. Is that part of decentralization, diversity and inclusion? Is that something important that we need to address in the blueprint? And then the final topic is how much research should we include? Daniel has, as the head of the RN DAO, they started trying to map all of the DAO tooling that there is. And every time they came together, there was more. And so part of it is we would like to research the tooling that we can use for the SingularityNet, but we don't want to spend a lot of time. So should it just be like a really overview chapter and let it do letter? Like, so that's about that. What should we include and how much should we include? So Judith is going to open the rooms. And remember, the discussion isn't about what to write there, but whether these topics should even be in the blueprint at all. Because right now we're just trying to create the right outline for our blueprint. So should these topics be in the blueprint, yes or no? All right, Judith, are you opening those up? And we'll probably come out too, and it'll be, let's do 20 minutes, 25 minutes, so we'll have enough time to discuss what happened in the rooms, right? So 25 minutes, something like that. I'd love to hear anybody talk about how that process went. If there was a conclusion at the end, of course, we'd love to hear that. But also, how did the process go and how did you make a decision? Did you make a decision? Did you end up going off on tangents? What happened? And just because somebody in your room says something, like definitely if they say a different perspective than you have, like speak up as well. So how did the managing, was there disagreement? I have no idea. Like our room was very, I'm sure, very different from the other room. So, and it was a pretty large group, right? So how things go in like groups of 4 or 5 or 7 is different than how it goes in 2 people. So yeah, love to hear anybody share both what you decided, what the disagreements are, and you know, how did it go and how did you come to a conclusion, or did you at all?
So just for clarity, are you asking about the other breakout room than the one we were in, or just anybody?
No, I'm asking each person to talk about how their own breakout room went. Yeah, how did your breakout room go? What did you learn? Did you change your mind? Did other people change their minds? Did you shut up because people were too annoying? Or whatever it was.
Well, I can say ours was great. And one thing that I've started to learn is that I'm seeing more connections between documentation and education than I did before.
Anything, do you want to talk about, did the room agree? Did the room disagree? What happened?
Oh, I just didn't want to speak for everybody. Okay, yeah, we started off kind of talking about whether these things are part of the blueprint, and I think as we went on, the more we thought they were. We raised some interesting issues about things like translation and how if everything's in English, it can present dramatic barriers. We looked at education that's not about ideologies, but about concrete data was raised by Guillermo, which I thought was really interesting. And we talked about this question of should people be expected to have a certain level of understanding before they get involved in governance or in voting or whatever, and how the hell you would tell whether somebody had that level. And we also kind of raised this issue of let's not vote. It's terrible. Let's try to find other ways to make decisions. But oh yeah, no, what I should have added is that towards the end we came to the conclusion I think that everybody agreed with, which is that on the surface, things like documentation and education look like just a function rather than a part of the blueprint. But we decided, no, it does belong in the blueprint in terms of the methodologies used, whether we're using decentralized approaches in our education and in our documentation. And possibly with documentation, who controls access to it might be the most important element.
Yeah, that was the most interesting for me too, is thinking about, well, if I'm the person who has the keys to the documents, right, and nobody else can change them and I can change the truth. And so, yeah, how do we decentralize the act, like who gets to write or change the documentation or comment the documentation or upload YouTube videos. Like those are like points of centralization that we need to think about in terms of controlling the data flow. Because I brought out up the fact that we haven't published the last 2 of these meetings because there's a point of centralization there. So it's very interesting. Yeah. Anybody else in our room want to speak up before we put the other people on the spot?
I think I covered most, to be
And
honest.
by the way, I started out thinking that we didn't need it and ended up being like, oh yeah, I think we need this. Like I was convinced, like even just by my own speaking out loud and by other people speaking out loud, I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, we didn't have much disagreements to report on and how we dealt with those. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we had major disagreements.
Oh, so let's hear from the other room. That was a very popular room, so I know something must have happened there.
Well, we didn't exactly agree. There was a good split of opinion, but we didn't fight. Let's say it that way. I actually don't think we came to a real conclusion. Like we didn't agree. We just listened to the both sides of the opinions, why the programs should be included and why they should not be included. And yeah, does anyone from the room want to speak to it? Did you want us to go over the opinions? Or
There was agreement on a sense that the names probably are used, but there is like a difference between should they be a separate section or just as a reference. As even if for those who are like, oh, let's keep that functioning role on top, and I brought out like the fact that the idea that you want to use Blueprint as like going over and seeing that if you are building a community, would you want a deep funding program in your community, or you want a funding grant program that incentivize people to submit proposals and ideas? Like there is a difference between those two in some level, because they can think of like a funding program, but it may not be exactly as deep funding. And that Blueprint should, for me, provide abstraction. But the similarity is that even if in the case of when you provide just a function, showing the reference to deep funding and ambassador program is a use case to put into the Blueprint, just to have like a, if you're interested in this, these are the things that are used in Singularity.
Anyone else want to say something? I mean, I'm interested to hear also, like you had a conversation, and what would have helped you come to an agreement or come to a, do you even know who agreed and who disagreed at the end? Like at the end, sort of as we were wrapping up in our group, we said, does anybody disagree anymore? You know, it was just kind of a consensus or whatever, veto type of vote. Did you guys, like, what would have helped you at least have a conclusion?
I think that like what the differences that were coming up were sourced in the difference in understanding of the function of the blueprint. So, for example, Asa said that it would be good that there is a simple and clear description and kind of guidance, you know, like information, what those programs are, you know, how they are running and so on, just for simplicity of like, there's the document where I can orient myself in all this, you know, like thing, yes, how this organization is functioning. So, so the function would be then kind of informational and navigational in terms of like usage, like being a member of the organization. And another approach would be, and I was more on the side that it's like a meta-governance set of recipes. Yeah? So how the entire network is functioning in its generative layer. You know, so how new programs, who initiates programs, who ends programs, how this whole cycle is running. So it's a regulatory framework for, you know, like. Not only organizational governance, but management, program management, and so on and so on. So but it's a different function, yes. And in this different function, I would start from a really big picture perspective that it's a meta framework for running and expanding global network. Okay, and the size it has now, it's kind of acknowledged. So those things are functioning like that. But if you want to add this, if you want to add this, if you want to add this, this is how to go about it. So, and then the description of the particular program would be like one line that in this year, this is it, and link to the website. Yeah, so something. But it starts from like the difference was in the understanding of a function of the document altogether, I believe.
And this is a very intentional way of approaching it, because as you can imagine, Daniel and Johnny and I had all kinds of theoretical discussions of what's going to be in the blueprint and theoretical disagreements about it. And we are very intentional in saying, let's put something down and talk about it in a practical way, not in a theoretical way. And it's fascinating that it comes right up like, well, it depends what you think the blueprint is, and then the sections follow from that. And so, and what's going to be in the sections, which we'll present to you maybe next week. I don't know, we haven't necessarily scheduled for next week, but that might be a great thing. We've gone through and decided what do we want in each section, and we want to present that. I think we'll present that at the end of this week for a comment, and maybe we'll have a discussion about it. Is that, we didn't go through this topic today, but how much research should we do is going to be a question there, right? Like, so that's the next topic, is like, let's say we decide on the sections, each section has a template, right? And again, that's going to depend what are you going to use it for? And of course, Marta comes with her thing, is like, well, I'm creating a decentralized thing for NewNet, so I want this to be as generic as possible for my purposes. And it's like, well, but the Supervisory Council is being paid by the foundation, so they want it to be as applicable as possible. And you have, it's not exactly a conflict of interest, but different dynamics. I'm going to call it different dynamics of why we want a blueprint. Cool. Anyone else from that room want to weigh in either on how it went, what you decided, whether it could have been more organized? I don't know how you guys, like we had a thing that happened in governance. I'm going to speak about this. We talked about unspoken things, right? Because I was in that room, it automatically defaulted to I moderated the room. People raised their hands instead of calling out and expected me to say, oh, it's your turn. And then like that was an automatic thing that happened without anybody speaking about it. And so I don't know what happened in your room in terms of who moderated it. Was it more chaotic? And did that influence how the decisions did? Because I was able to say towards the end, okay, do we agree? Because I had the talking stick, right? So was that a different process for the other room? Essa, go ahead.
So I'll say that in the room that we were, I think Daniel did a lot. He tried to explain the blueprints, because that was like the major issue. I think we were having like difficulty trying to even understand the blueprint itself, the flow, the pattern, and what it actually entails. So he did a great job in trying to bring everybody to understand what the blueprint was. And I think that took like a bit of our time. So before we were able to really go into whether or not to leave these programs as it were and come to a consensus, the time was already like fast spent. But we were able to, point out some things. For example, I am of the opinion that we leave the programs names as it has been for seamless onboarding and all of that, because not so many people are so conversant with decentralization. And if we're trying to bring in people, things has to be as generic and as easy to assimilate as possible, so that people can actually, pick up wherever they want to be and function as quickly as they want to function, because people are quick to tie a name to something than just having, oh, okay, so we have a part for business entrepreneur, yada, 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 instead of, oh, we have a place for, we have deep funding where you can, if you're an entrepreneur, whatever, you fall in this category. And if you want to be like more of a community person, we have the ambassador and you fall under this category and these are the functions like that, instead of just having like just ordinary functions like, okay, we have entrepreneur, AI developers and all of that. So that's my own opinion. That was what I thought. And Martha also gave her own opinion as well. And Tivo, is it Tivo or Trevo, also gave his own opinion. He believes having a function and having the program as a reference is better. So I think that was what happened. But overall, I think Daniel did like a great job, and we actually came to an agreement that for us to be able to come to a good conclusion, it would be better for us to go over the blueprint. So he shared us 2 links that we can go over and make suggestions, so that people that are reading through can look at it and add whether the suggestion is necessary or not. So that was our conclusion, I guess.
Cool. I thought I had a heavy hand in our group, but it looks like Daniel had an even heavier hand. And again, I'm speaking about that because that's a point of centralization, right? Daniel and I are the Supervisory Council. We are guiding this process, and we've been voted into that position, right? So it's not like we came from in some ways, we're a top-down, right? Like Daniel and I had a heavy hand in those conversations because we were elected, which was a decentralized process. And so there's also that balance, right? If you elected somebody, how much authority should they have? And Daniel guided that conversation by telling you why we're doing a blueprint in the first place, which Daniel and I decided, it's like, so there's this, it's a really big question for me. Like, what is the right level of authority that I have as an elected person? And as the person who's running this meeting or whatever that means, and how do I deal with that? Guillermo, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly either, so.
Yes, you are, Grace, thank you. So going back, and I think I'm going to address what you're talking. I just added a comment on the document, so I'm going to read what I wrote. In terms of standard documentation, a document needs an index and page number. Even though it is a development stage, and this change on each iteration is necessary to be addressed efficiently. Okay, so it doesn't matter who's in charge, who's leading. So we need, and this I'm going back to conflict resolution, GL concept. We follow methodology, and we build a blueprint. It needs to have that inputs or insights in how we work. I found it very stressing to read something down that I don't know. I'm old. I'm paper kind of generation. I'm a book man. If I don't have a freaking index, it's hard. More in this kind of document. Jan shared something yesterday or Sunday, and it was easy. It was bullet pointing the index. It's like, okay, I like this, I like. And even though we are discussing items that a blueprint needs to have, we need an index. So at the end, what I'm trying to address is like going back to the needs of documentation and education. This is part of each way you put it around: documentation, education. It doesn't matter the order. At the end is what you were saying, the subjects you're addressing, the content of what you are educating, and then translation. All the language is something that I don't know if you pointed out and I think it was relevant on our discussion. How decentralized we're going to be able to do it if we just speak English? And all these communities are decentralizing their own objectives in different languages. So AGI would need the use of AI to speak one language. I don't know if it's binary. At the end, it is, but or it's math, because it is always math. but definitely something to discuss.
Anything else people want to add from the rooms, or anything that's come up for people around any of this that we haven't talked about, or that we've talked about and all of a sudden you're like, hey, wait a second. Cool. How was the process for people? Was that like how was that process of like dealing with differences of opinion? Was that, oh, we do this all the time. How was that for people? Was it like, were those breakout rooms cool? Did you like that? How did it go for you just in general? Like more, do you want more of these things? We have many more topics to cover.
I would like to cover all the topics and give more like opinions on everything. But right now, as again, like this is what happens actually quite often, that people come and go when they can. And because of this different cadence of people understanding where the situation, sometimes it's hard to kind of get a decision out of it, because they are maybe first time, like Antonio mentioned, their first time to actually go into Blueprint. So it's, you can't really force people to come to a decision. And then we never really figured out where is the right place to do a decision when there are, yes, many people are in call, where half of them are undecided, they don't know what to choose from. And then there are a few experts who have different opinions, but how do you weight them? And so it's always like a hard place. So I guess the best we could do is just provide all our insights of our opinions, and then I hope Daniel made some meeting notes and also created a recording that will be used then for those who got elected to use it at the best knowledge of it and make their decision at the end themselves.
Yeah. Okay, Vani?
Yeah, like we've said, we didn't have a lot of disagreement in our room, but what I noticed is that some of us started to say a bit about how we arrived at the point of view that we had, and like how our thought had changed. And that is also quite an interesting input in terms of how to make a decision. I think it's just maybe something we should have in the toolkit. The other thing I wanted to mention was that before we properly started talking about the topic, we were talking about something that I didn't write down, and we said, oh, that would be a really good thing for a future breakout room. And I wondered if anybody could remember what the hell it was. This is why you need documentation. Sorry.
Yeah, no, we started to go into what should be under documentation. I was like, okay, that's not the topic of this, right? I think it was something else.
Oh, I don't know if it was the question of should people be required to have a certain level of knowledge before they're allowed to make decisions. I don't think that was it. There was something else. But anyway, it might come to us.
Judith, go ahead.
For me personally, I find the process difficult because you're in these breakout rooms, you have a very limited amount of time, and obviously you don't want to go on talking forever because you want the other people to speak as well. So you go around the room, now everybody has spoken for 1 minute, and then you're kind of like, well, now what? So now it's just missing the decision-making process at the end, like whether it's a vote or yeah, it's always difficult when you just have meetings where people just talk and you don't have an additional tool for either recording opinions or recording votes or anything. I think you always run the risk in meetings or breakout rooms to just chat, and then what do you do at the end with all of this information? So I would always prefer to have either a Miro board or a vote at the end or something.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of things that came up, right? One has to do with time, right? How much time do people have? Some people who are, we have this again, right? The Supervisory Council, like we're paid something. The foundation people have a full-time job doing this, and then the rest of you are just doing this out of the goodness of your hearts. And that creates an imbalance, whether you like it or not. Who's going to go through the whole blueprint and read it and make their comments? Like theoretically, that's completely decentralized. Anybody could write anything. It's recorded what they wrote. If somebody keeps getting, if they wanted to come and say, listen, I've written these things in the document and nobody related to them, they deleted all my comments, like theoretically, everything is completely transparent, but in fact, it has to do with how much time you have to devote, which is an imbalance of power as well. And then, like you said, we're having these discussions and it's like, well, this isn't really the decision-making forum, and what is, and where do we? And we've been having this discussion about that, like, should we, the blueprint itself isn't going to create rules that have to be implemented. It's more like a suggestion of, it's not a specifications document that then goes to the development department, right? It's much more like, here are a bunch of different ways that things can be done. Here are some experiments we can try. And then when we actually allocate funds to do any of the things there, that'll be the decision-making moment. So, but at the same time, you kind of want to ratify the document in some ways. Like, we ratify that we participated in it. And, you know, so there's a very, what is the decision that's really being made? Because we've been discussing voting on these different sections, and I'm like, well, but because the document itself doesn't have any enforcing power on it, it's much more like a recommendation document, then does voting on it have any meaning? You know, and then maybe it's something like, I mean, you could think of something ridiculous like, okay, on each paragraph, you know, check a check mark with your initials, like initial it with your wallet that you agree with this section, and then we'll see who likes which sections, and then, you know, this is ratified and that's not ratified. I mean, you could go in all kinds of ways, but in a document that's non-binding, right, what is it, what does decision mean?
If I can check a little bit, I think it very much depends on how much of a kind of demos this body wants to be in terms of democracy, you know, because it's really, you know, like self-positioning. Like, do you or we understand this body to be kind of advisory, feeding back to the management of the foundation because, you know, like they have initiated this process. I understand that it's not like a binding, like the outcome in terms of the blueprint is not binding. It's not a voice of community, but it is to be proposed to be a formulation of the voice of the community. Yes. So in that sense, does community take this opportunity to become a conversation partner with the existing structures? Yes. Or does the community structure itself still like kind of like an advisory, you know, like, please consider this voice, and like, you know, it depends on the people. Yes. And what inspires me to be here, it's mostly, you know, like I have just one reason, you know, I very much seriously take the question that Ben Goertzel is asking: who is going to govern the AGI once it's there? You know, maybe I'm stupid that I'm like believing that this question is real, you know, but this is why I want to be like in those processes. And if, you know, and if the developers team hands in and says, humans, this is the AGI, I want the humans to be organized, you know, for say, okay, we know what to do, you know, and in that sense, the body that now we are meeting at is like, either it will step up to the challenge, you know, and start like showing this decentralized democratic process in motion, you know, and actually speaking on behalf of the people, you know, and then people say, okay, this is our voice, that is it. Like, there will be a vote, I understand, yes. Or we kind of like saying, okay, we are just, you know, making suggestions because they said what should be there. This is why we are. So basically, like positioning everybody in the room as employees or kind of unpaid employees, you know. so you see, like, and it's an open question, yes, and which people either like take this route or this.
I could not think of a better summary or way to complete the meeting than what Marta just said. So thank you, everybody, for participating. And, you know, we'll keep having these talks, and the blueprint will be, like I said, summarized. And I think we'll probably have another one of these next week. Maybe we'll try and come up with some times in the coming weeks that are also friendlier for different parts of the world. But yeah, thank you, everybody. It's been a real honor, as usual.